Hi everyone, I'm Michelle Anbar-Goldstein. I'm a social worker with the Forensic Dual Diagnosis Specialty Service.
Hello, thanks everyone for having us. My name is Radek Budin. I'm a psychologist at CAMH, and we're both in the Forensic Dual Diagnosis Specialty Service.
Okay. Can you see us all right with your camera? Okay, great. Does anyone mind if we don't stand up? Because Love is Blind finale was on last night and I'm tired. So we're going to be going over our service today, because I know we often get a lot of questions from people in the DS sector about what it is exactly that we do. And then we'll be reviewing, we'll give a little Forensic 101 in service about what the forensic mental health system is. By all means, I'm hoping that we can get through everything on time and have some time at the end for questions. But if there's anything that you need clarification about, like, raise your hand. Hopefully we'll be able to answer it. So, dual diagnosis in Ontario. Oh, la-di-da. Oh no, I'll do this. Okay. Hopefully I can read from here. So, I have a clicker.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
So, there are more than 66,000 adults living with developmental disabilities in Ontario. I mean, this number is from 2013. I presume that it's probably higher at this point. 48.6 of them have one or more concurrent psychiatric disorders. As many as 51.8% of individuals with ID present with some form of challenging behavior. Now, at CAMH, I think when we look at dual diagnosis, we often take challenging behavior as the dual diagnosis on top of developmental disability, but for the purpose of this presentation, we'll just be looking at additional psychiatric diagnoses.
So 1 in 8 patients in Ontario hospitals receive specialized care have a dual diagnosis. More than 35% of those individuals remain in hospital for more than 5 years. Dually diagnosed clients account for 37% of the ALC population across Ontario in Ontario's 6 psychiatric hospitals. That essentially means that if they were to be released from hospital that day, that they have nowhere to go. Only 4% of the hospitalized population require this level of support and could be supported in the community, and less than 20% of them are receiving services designed for individuals with dual diagnosis.
So, by show of hands, is anyone here supporting people who are currently ALC? No? Okay, good. So that is relevant.
Does everyone know what ALC is?
Alternate level of care, guys. Yeah?
It was up there. I just didn't feel like reading it out.
We defined it, Deanna. Is everyone familiar with the Ombudsman report, Nowhere to Turn? Yeah? Ish? So this was released August 2016. It basically was a 4-year investigation. It looked at more than 1,400 complaints. And what they found is that institutional care no longer happens through design, but by default. So although we've gone through deinstitutionalization in Ontario and people are living within the community, the fact remains that because there's a lack of resource, we're institutionalizing people because we don't have any other choice. So people are sitting in psychiatric hospitals and regular old hospitals and long-term care and that sort of thing. So I'm sure everyone, most of you work within the DS sector and you can really speak to that when we're looking at accessing funding for new people coming to the system, that's the priority. So 16 of the 60 recommendations were related to the criminal justice and the forensic system as part of that report.
So we have a quote here from that report. We heard about several cases where incarceration became fail-safe when the developmental services sector could not provide adequate supports. It is nothing short of shameful that we are still imprisoning some adults with developmental disabilities in these circumstances. So essentially, our team sort of came about in response to this report.
So, Very few individuals with moderate to severe intellectual disability are found within the criminal justice system and within the forensic mental health system, while individuals with mild to borderline intellectual functioning are overrepresented. Now, it should be noted that even if the offense is the same, right? Let's say someone with a moderate disability threatens their parent with a knife. It's less likely that they're going to be found guilty of an offense or go through mental health diversion or through the forensic system, as opposed to someone who has a higher intellectual capacity. It's more likely that they're going to be found there, which creates a huge problem because a lot of people they present as though they're a lot more capable than they might be. They might go undetected. So many individuals with intellectual disability that come into contact with the law may not be identified as having an intellectual disability. So part of our service is making sure that they are identified.
All right, so based on a recent, well, not so recent, but we did this over a couple years. We estimated that as many as 32% of patients across the forensic and non-forensic inpatient units at CAMH were suspected of having a developmental disability. And again, suspected, I want to highlight that because when we actually went and did the assessments, I'd say about 50% of those people ended up being eligible. But it's quite tricky. Again, these are individuals that have gone throughout their lives, never before identified. They usually have, again, because they're dual clients, so they have a psychiatric disorder, and sometimes you get that diagnostic overlay that, you know, it sometimes makes it hard to identify the ID piece. In 2016, approximately 60% of individuals presented at Clinical Case Conference were forensic inpatients, and CAMH provides treatment, care, and supervision to approximately 550 individuals under the Ontario Review Board, otherwise known as the ORB.
And we'll get to that toward the end of our presentation. So, somewhere to turn. Radek laughed at me because it's like, you know, nowhere to turn, somewhere to turn. So that's us. CAMH's Forensic Dual Diagnosis Specialty Service. Yeah. So our service is CAMH's contribution to a joint initiative between MCCSS and the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care to support people with developmental disabilities and or dual diagnosis who are in the forensic mental health system and are ready to begin their move back to the community. In addition to that, and probably I should have added it to the slide, but a part of this is also, it's like a pre-crime thing. So avoiding and hopefully with the goal of having people not enter the forensic mental health system. So when we receive external consults or external referrals, that's usually the goal.
All right, so what are the eligibility criteria for CAMH patients when it comes to ID? So suspected or confirmed intellectual or developmental disability who are at least 18 years of age and are subject to a disposition from the ORB and or have current or pending criminal charges or recent justice involvement and or are registered with FICE. What does it stand for?
I don't know.
Forensic. That's essentially FICE is a service that operates within the South Detention Center, and again, they're responsible for identifying anybody that has mental health issues within the criminal, well, within the jails, and then if that is suspected, they can be referred to CAMH for further assessment. And again, we'll get into that stuff a little bit later. So what are the eligibility criteria for external referrals for our service? Individuals have to be confirmed as having an intellectual or developmental disability, who have current or pending criminal charges and or recent justice involvement. They have to be part of DSO. And for external clients, our goal is to, again, avoid them being thrust into the forensic mental health system if possible.
Because we'll learn that it is extremely difficult for people with a dual diagnosis to be absolutely discharged from forensic mental health, so we don't want them to go in the first place. So our program has 3 pillars, and that's our mandate. So we look at engagement, consultation, and education. In terms of engagement, I mean, there's a row there of Christian Horizon staff that I think can speak to this particular part of our program. So it's we have a program called DD TRIP. So it's the Dual Diagnosis Transitional Rehabilitation Housing Program. So basically what that is 2 forensic beds in a developmental sector transitional treatment home. The stay is anywhere between 18 to 24 months. And now it's similar to the treatment beds that you access through Clinical Case Conference, but rather than the access point be that table, we are the access point. So we're determining who's going into that bed, and they're all coming from CAMH forensics. So there are 5 members in the program, 3 of which are under the ORB. 2 of those people we case manage as a team. So this is sort of just a schematic of the supports that a person in that program would receive. So they're receiving clinical supports from our team. So typically we have like an RN, a BT, myself, Radek. There's our manager. Within Christian Horizons, they also have access to clinical supports. They have like direct support workers who are working with them, the program manager, et cetera, et cetera.
And our lovely students.
And of course, they're so good.
All right, so so again, well, Michelle sort of went over this in terms of who our team consists of, and when we have a nurse, we unfortunately had our lovely nurse retire. They engage in risk management and assessment, medication management, medical care, and consultation in terms of family, for families, and contact community liaisons for educational, vocational, and recreational activities. Our behavioral therapist provides consultation on behavioral support services. The support needs, within the home. They conduct functional behavior assessments. They design behavioral support plans, conduct staff training, and monitor and evaluate implementation of programming in the home. So I know that Louis, he would go to the Christian Horizons home and aid in programming there, as well as other places in the community. Our lovely social worker, Michelle, is involved in systems level coordination and advocacy, transition planning, family systems work, and direct therapeutic supports. And myself, I'm involved in carrying out assessments. As I had mentioned, anyone that's sort of suspected of an intellectual disability or developmental disability, I'll get called in and try to figure that piece out. It's quite difficult at times. And then again, we do that with the hopes of connecting them to DSO. And I also consult with other service providers when it comes to assessment and treatment, and I provide education to various frontline staff.
So it's worth mentioning with regards to the nursing support that many of the clients that we're supporting within our program are extremely medically complex. We'll go through a case study shortly that talks about one of them since graduated from our program, but it's a real like holistic service. It's similar to like all the CNSC, that sort of, you know, really well-rounded support that's available.
CNSC?
Oh, Central Network of Specialized Care, is that right? I'm looking at you, Dios.
Yes.
Centralized.
Yeah.
Centralized.
Yeah, right.
Acronyms, guys. So our second pillar is consultation. So we operate by guiding principles. We're person-centered support by an interdisciplinary team, which we've talked about. It's comprehensive. We address multiple domains of functioning and safety. We focus on de-institutionalization, that's a huge one, and successful community living. I think part of the reason social worker wasn't initially on the team, on the FDDSS team, but because of the connection and like they, you know, I came into the service because of the DS connection and being able to facilitate like a real smooth transition into the permanent placement in the community is integral. There's continuity of care, support across environments, so we'll typically get involved when a person is inpatient at CAMH, we'll liaise with the inpatient teams who might not have the DS lens to adequately support the person according to their learning and support needs. So we do a lot of like augmentation of therapeutic programs, like for example, working with the Sexual Behaviors Clinic on their manualized program to help make it be appropriate for people with disabilities. And then we'll move with that person as they transition into the community. So people are always receiving our care as a team until we determine that everything is stable, that the supports in the community are adequate for their needs. There's fluid movement across sectors and facilitation of effective interagency collaboration. I often describe it as being like a translator, right? The DS sector and the mental health sector and the health sector, everyone's speaking a different language. So it's really important that we're able to sort of provide those operational definitions of what it is that we're talking about when it comes to client support. And then early identification and preventative responding.
So, we collaborate with teams supporting close to 100 individuals, and again, that involves a coordination of complex biomedical, social, psychological, psychiatric, and behavioral health services. We are supporting developmental sector. We have, supported developmental sector eligibility for approximately 25 clients in hospital, and identification of confirmed discharge locations for 15 ALC forensic inpatients.
When we were preparing for this presentation yesterday, I think the numbers are actually really important if you think about it. Like I know when you look at 15 ALC forensic inpatients, it doesn't seem like a big number, but if you consider the costs per day to the Ministry of Health, it's astronomical. So I know one of our individuals, for example, was sitting in hospital at Michael Guerin at $1,600 a day. So annually, that's about 580,000.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
She also has a math degree.
I don't, but I got 100 in calculus. And then if you look at the cost per day in forensics, I think we estimated that's approximately 3,200. So that's 1.186 million a year. So then if you look at the cost in the developmental sector, like it's way less, right? You're looking at $200,000 a year. It's peanuts. Not really, but comparatively. So our last pillar of service is education, and that's extremely important. So we provide information about the forensic mental health system in the context of developmental services, collaboration with the centralized network of specialized care and developmental services Ontario coordinators, review and update of information on the community needs list. I called Deanna a lot.
Yep.
It's good. It's good. We provide information on developmental services in the context of the forensic system, inpatient team consultation, support with referrals and appeals. That's like with the DSO. Like if someone is deemed ineligible, we'll happily, press it until they are deemed eligible. Clinical conference presentations, transition. What does that say? Transitioning patients out of hospital. And then we also do focused educational trainings. So we have the clozapine administration monitoring and mental status examination, 22Q11 partial deletion syndrome training, behavioral competencies training, introduction to DD training for CAMH inpatient and outpatient workers, sexuality and social skills training, assist training for frontline DS staff, forensic 101, schizophrenia 101. Yeah, there's a lot going on. So, and this is just a plug for a program. If you want any of these trainings or educational initiatives at your agencies, just holler. Like our referral just goes to me. I'll send you a form, fill it out.
All right, so we're gonna talk about Joe. Obviously, their names have been changed for confidentiality purposes. And yeah, this is an FDDSS case study. So Joe is, or was at the time when we got involved, a 25-year-old single male diagnosed with schizophrenia and 22Q11 partial deletion syndrome and mild intellectual disability with suspected autism spectrum disorder. He was found not criminally responsible under the ORB in March 2013, and it was determined that he was incapable to make treatment-related decisions, and his mother was made his substitute decision maker.
So it's worth mentioning 22q11 deletion syndrome. So it's a really complex genetic disorder. It comes with a myriad of health problems. Typically, people have a diagnosis of schizophrenia and a developmental disability. There's congenital heart defects that are associated with it. There's definite issues with the endocrine system, and a lot of times, because if a person is on antipsychotics to treat the schizophrenia, there ends up being like metabolic syndrome, and we really have to monitor them. There's issues with thyroid, so I mean, I'm not going to read through the whole slide, but what I will say is that having an RN on our team was like so important, because really like mismanaging the health needs of this person could really be a fatal issue.
Yeah, especially I think this particular client was on clozapine,
Yeah.
and a person on clozapine has to be closely monitored. Okay, so at the age of 18, he became more withdrawn. He quit school, became very suspicious, guarded, and developed paranoid, grandiose, somatic delusions, and started experiencing auditory command hallucinations. Even when treated with antipsychotics, he continued to deteriorate. He wasn't sleeping or eating, and he was having increased angry outbursts. And his mother was staying up all night to watch him because he was threatening to sadly throw boiling water at the family. And he had become very aggressive towards his father, and at some point even through TV.
So the index offense, so that's the offense that led him into the forensic system, occurred in March 2013. He had a knife and was threatening to kill his family and himself. They struggled with his brother, who was afraid that he would attack his father. A lot of like his delusions and hallucinations revolved around issues with his family. He thought they weren't his real family, that he had a family elsewhere. He was on medication, but obviously it was the wrong medication because it was having little effect in controlling his symptoms. He remained in the hospital under secure forensics between 2013 and 2017, which is a very typical amount of time, if not short, in comparison to some of the rest of our guys in the system. In 2015, he went to the Deglish Clinic, which is like the 22q deletion syndrome clinic, and they suggested treatment with clozapine, which has been so effective for him. It's like dramatically reduced his psychotic symptoms and his challenging behaviors. He's a completely different person, and that enabled him to live in the community. And the association with the Deglish Clinic and getting that on board was our nurse who made that connection. He was discharged to the Dual Diagnosis Transitional Rehabilitation Housing Program, DD-TRIP, with Christian Horizons in February 2017. So in terms of treatment in the community, we looked at risk management. So when we talk about risk management in the context of forensics, it's making sure that the public is safe, and that person is as safe as possible under the least onerous and least restrictive, measures possible, yes. So that is the role really of an outpatient team. He had medical support, so he had a bowel routine and meal intake, endocrinology, blood work, and screening. And I know, some of the staff here can probably speak to the work that Janice did with the group home, that's our old nurse, to make sure that all of that was taken care of. There's medication monitoring and management, so clozapine, blood work, PRN protocols. And this was a person who, like, in addition to having schizophrenia, he also had like a pretty severe anxiety disorder. So monitoring that and sort of teasing out when it's appropriate to give a PRN and when this is a function of anxiety, when it's a function of his like hallucination or delusions or whatever, was complicated. We did family systems work. His family is incredible. We worked so closely with his mother and his sister, and the sister ended up speaking at one of our conferences. Like, she's just a fabulous advocate. We did functional analysis and behavior support plans to increase pro-social behavior and reduce challenging behaviors. And we did a lot of skill building and social skills building, community integration. Is that you?
Yeah. So he spent 24 hours 24 months in the DD-TRIP bed. treatment bed. We found an increase in independent living skills. There was increased engagement in community activities. And again, passport funding is amazing for that. Improved coping skills in terms of anxiety in the community. There was extended time with families. So again, once the symptoms were treated, he was able to spend time with his family again, mostly on the weekends. And he developed healthy relationships with staff and co-residents. And he is now has a permanent residential placement with DS agency.
And this is a person who couldn't leave his house before. He now attends day program 3 times a week. Like it's a massive change. It's like our biggest success story. So from the client perspective, we asked him about it. So he said, I feel safe living at this group home. I sleep in a comfortable room and enjoy good food from the staff. He says room because he didn't want to sleep in his bed. He slept on the floor. Overall communication between staff and families contributed to a strong support system, which he has been progressing. His needs and interests are being met. He has become more confident and comfortable, developed new hobbies and interests, and adapted to a daily routine. That's a quote from his family.
So some of the lessons learned through this case was that many dually diagnosed individuals remain unidentified and unsupported within the forensic mental health system and elsewhere in the hospital. So preventing the criminalization of behavioral health issues in dual diagnoses continues to be a significant gap. We're doing our best. The forensic mental health system and the developmental service sectors speak a very different language. Again, Michelle's an expert at translation, and strong community partnerships are invaluable in supporting individuals in complex situations and with complex conditions.
Honestly, like that's the most important lesson. If you learned anything, it's just that bolded statement. So, what are we good for time?
Yep.
How much do we have left? Yay. So, crime or illness. So, society believes, this is from the Canadian Criminal Code. So, society believes that it's unfair to punish people for a criminal act if they have a mental disorder that prevents them from either understanding what they've done or appreciating the consequences of what they've done.
So you can imagine individuals with intellectual disability often have trouble with that kind of thing. So crime or illness. Individuals who display symptoms of severe mental illness have a 67% higher probability of being arrested than do individuals who do not display such symptoms.
Individuals who display symptoms of severe mental illness are also more likely to be detained in jail.
Once jailed, individuals who display symptoms of severe mental illness will stay incarcerated 2 to 8 times longer than their non-mentally ill counterparts, sadly.
15 to 40% of Canadian prison inmates meet the criteria for mental disorder other than personality or substance use disorders, which is like a jarring number if you think about it.
25% of individuals in the correction system in Canada have cognitive deficits. Cognitive deficits, it's quite a broad thing to talk about, but basically that means like thinking difficulties, so that could involve, memory, language, ability to think abstractly, or, so yeah, this is again, quite significant.
It really does speak to sort of like a systemic discrimination against people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as people with mental health issues, right? Because we have a system that's not meeting the needs of who is being incarcerated. So approximately 10% of men and 18% of women in the federal corrections system in Canada fall within the low, extreme, or borderline ID ranges of cognitive impairment. So what is that?
Yeah, so essentially that means the low extreme, I believe, is people fall within the second percentile or below, meaning that 98% of the population have higher intellectual abilities. In the borderline range, it's usually around the 5th percentile, again, meaning that 95% of the population have intellectual abilities that surpass theirs. So, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, with estimates ranging from anywhere from 2 to 20% of the offender population.
As many as 24% of court defendants may have an intellectual disability.
33% of incarcerated youth in the U.S. are identified as eligible for services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.
That's a third, which speaks again to sort of the institutionalization of people with developmental disabilities. Wild number. So this is also, by the way, the doom and gloom portion of the presentation. In case everyone, it ends eventually to more doom and gloom. So individuals with developmental disabilities are overrepresented in the forensic mental health system too, making up an estimated 12% of the forensic inpatient population. This is Canada-wide, as compared to 0.8% in the general population.
So vastly overrepresented in terms of what you would expect. By age 21, 20% of individuals with autism spectrum disorders will have interacted with the police.
As many as 30% of individuals on specialist or DD forensic inpatient units may have autism. Although I wonder how many specialist DD units there are in the forensic system, but when they exist, that's what it is.
Individuals with autism spectrum disorders in secure forensic care have significantly longer lengths of stay than those without.
Over the last several decades, there appears to be an increasing trend in individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities referred to community forensic services.
So clearly this is quite a disturbing trend. Here's a quote. These results may reflect changes in society whereby the courts are becoming more comfortable with defendants with intellectual disability and services more willing to involve the police when there are incidents of offending behavior.
So if we're looking at sort of the criminal risk factors in DD, they're similar to the general population, but differ also. So we have youth, men, people who come from socially disadvantaged social locations, unemployment, familial offending, a history of behavioral challenges, which encompasses a lot of our guys, poor coping strategies, again, as a result of maybe cognitive deficits from an intellectual disability or whatever other mental health diagnosis, and limited independence, which again, we all know that these are the folks that we're surveying.
So what are some of the vulnerabilities for an individual with an intellectual disability or developmental disability when it comes to the criminal justice system? There's sometimes limited understanding, so they're not really aware of their rights at arrest, cautions, restrictions, suggestibility, and acquiescence. So vulnerable to false confessions while in police custody. If anyone's seen the documentary Making a Murder, it's just horrendous to watch how the police sort of handled that situation. Poor coping with correctional settings, again, being quite vulnerable. You have some individuals in those settings that are really good at targeting that, sadly, and being sort of taken advantage of by other inmates.
There are also vulnerabilities that are specific to people on the autism spectrum disorder. So the risk of harsh sentences due to perceived lack of empathy or remorse. A lot of the external referrals that we're getting from justice-involved youth have to do with this. They're looking for social skills training for their children so that they present differently at court. But we can't do that because we can't provide clinical supports to outpatients, but we will hook them up with someone. They're disadvantaged in police interviews. There's vulnerability to exploitation, and that happens, sort of while they're engaging in criminal activity. We found like a lot of our people on the autism spectrum disorder end up being like drug mules, and they end up being sort of utilized by like, criminal organizations to do their bidding. And this comes from a place where, people are seeking out social interaction, and they're seeking out relationships. And so when you're weighing the advantages and the disadvantages in their minds, they're like, well, so when I'm taking this drug, but I also have a friend, and they're gonna call me, and I'm gonna spend time and that sort of thing, which is so sad. Difficulty in release planning, problems in conforming to established norms of inmate social behavior, which is huge, and like it really does contribute to the predation of people on the ASD spectrum. Increased risk of confrontation, and they're more likely to be bullied and to be socially isolated.
So, believe it or not, there are also some protective factors that related to ASD when it comes to incarceration. So there's rigidity and rule following, so that's a good thing. So there's significantly less probation violations and possible leniency within the criminal justice system. So diversion is twice as likely, while prosecution is half as likely. So again, like the forensic system is designed for the purpose of bringing people out of these situations, because it's understood that they have difficulties that have been lifelong, and yeah, so it's great when that kind of thing happens, the diversion.
But I will say, I know there's a bit of like a footnote to that, which is that the forensic system is designed to support people with mental health needs. The developmental piece, I think, is a little bit more difficult. And we'll get into, like, we're almost at our Forensic 101 section, so we can sort of explain it in more detail, but it doesn't really meet the needs of people with ID. So, predictors of police involvement. So we have physical aggression, which is the primary reason police are called. I'm sure you've all had clients where the police have been phoned for challenging behavior, for aggression, or for threatening aggression. Younger in age, living outside family home, and a lack of day programming or structured daily activities, which again speaks to a systemic issue of a lack of resources.
All right, so what are the pathways to criminal justice and the forensic mental health system when it comes to autism? So the most common offenses that we see for individuals suffering from ASD is violent behavior. So 81% of individuals end up in trouble because of that. Threatening conduct, destructive behavior, sexual offenses, arson, stalking, harassment, non-contact sexual offenses, and trespassing. And again, some of these things, because of the condition, sometimes it's just misunderstanding of like social cues and that kind of thing. But yeah, it will get people into trouble.
Look at that. We've reached the final part of our presentation. The Ontario Forensic Mental Health System. An overview. So this is just a schematic. Wrap it up.
You can't really see it, it's hard to
see. But we will send out the PowerPoints, and you can peruse it on your own time.
You can study it.
Yeah, then I'll test you. So, what is the forensic mental health system? So, the role is not to punish people, because it's not fair to punish a person who wasn't aware of what they were doing or wasn't aware of the consequence of what they were doing. So we're trying to reintegrate people into the community after rehabilitation and after stabilization. So society believes that it's unfair to punish people for a criminal act if they have a mental disorder that prevents them from understanding what they have done or appreciating the consequence. So it's not that they're not guilty. They're guilty of committing the crime, but they are not responsible. There's a mandate of ensuring public safety within the least onerous and least restrictive conditions possible to the person who committed the offense.
So, you know, in order to be guilty of a crime, you need two factors, right? It's made up of two factors. There's mens rea and actus rea. So actus rea means the actual act. So, you know, they have committed the offense, but in terms of their ability to, they didn't commit it with intent, right? So that's, yeah. So the Criminal Code of Canada states that if you're not guilty of an offense, if a mental order prevents you from appreciating the nature of your actions, right? So again, the act can be done, but they don't understand what that entails or the consequences of that. And knowing your actions were wrong. So imagine somebody that believes that God is telling them to do something. Well, you know, if you believe that, you're gonna listen to God.
Yeah. And it's not like, you know, there's like this real misconception that people can like fake it. Like they can plead, you know, it used to be called not guilty by reason of insanity. So, you know, there's this real public perception that you can like one flew over the cuckoo's nest and pretend that you're mentally ill, but that like there's so much that goes into this process and so much involvement from clinicians and assessment and that sort of thing that it could never happen. I mean, maybe it could, but like...
We do our best to make sure it does.
Our guys are. So, so you can either be NCR, so not criminally responsible, or you can be unfit to stand trial. So what that means is we're looking at two sorts of things. So number one, can you communicate with and effectively instruct your lawyer? So think of the people that we're supporting. If put in a situation where they've committed, let's say, a violent offense, can they talk to a lawyer about how they want their legal proceedings to go? Probably not. A lot of the time our guys fall into this category. And then secondarily, like we have this thing called the Taylor test. So they're questions around the judicial system and very simple. Like they're made to be sort of like a baseline understanding. So do you know where you are? Like checking their orientation, which obviously is important when you're looking at the mental status of people who are mentally ill. What is the role of the justice of the peace or the judge? Do you know the charges against you? What pleas are available to you? Do you know the possible consequences of being found guilty, not guilty? And do you understand what it means to take an oath? Now, there is such a thing called fitness training within the forensic system. So if a person is found unfit to stand trial, they might end up at CAMH and we might go through coaching with them to sort of teach them these things so they could stand trial and then be deemed not criminally responsible. But a lot of the time, the fitness training is done by people who don't have a background or a lens in DD or ID. So you can imagine that it gets a bit complicated and convoluted. It doesn't really meet the needs of people. I should mention also that with regard to NCR, and I should have mentioned on a previous slide, that it's at the time of the offense. That's when you either don't appreciate what you did or don't appreciate the consequence. Like you could be stable and healthy afterward, after taking your medication or whatever. That doesn't change the fact that at the time of the offense you didn't know what was going on.
All right. So we mentioned the Ontario Review Board before. The ORB is usually made up of a psychiatrist, a lawyer, mental health professional, person from the community with a background in mental health, and a chairperson, again, usually a lawyer or a retired judge. And they're responsible for making decisions for the client, right? So they determine what level of security they'll be at, whether it be, you know, maximum security up in Waypoint, or, you know, less secure facilities, like, and we have minimum security level at CAMH. Whether you'll go to a hospital and which one, I think ideally they try to place people like close to their homes. When you can have privileges to go back into the community, and what kind of supervision and supports you should have when you go back into the community.
So the ORB will meet within 90 days after the disposition hearing, or within 45 days without one. Patients attend an annual ORB review in which the hospital provides an update of the patient's progress and the board makes decisions about any changes to the disposition. So in preparation for these ORB reviews, typically the case managers or the social workers on the inpatient units will really, it's like a novella detailing the last year, every single incident, every time that they threaded, like nothing, no stone is left unturned, so to speak. So when we have folks in living with DS service providers, like the communication is so intense between us and the staff and management at the group home, because we need to know everything that happens, because that will dictate the privileges and the disposition that person receives for the following year. And typically when we do have an annual ORB meeting, it'll be the case manager, but also like representatives from the developmental services home that will come, so that if the psychiatrist needs to clarify something or if the lawyer needs to ask a question, they're available there to answer anything that's necessary. So following like an ORB review, there's a reason for dispositions document that is given within 6 weeks. So it details why things have changed, or why the security has increased or decreased, or whatever the case may be.
So essentially you're getting a sense of risk in those situations. What are the levels of detention? So there's a detention order that can include secure, general, or community living. A conditional discharge means that the person remains under the auspices of the ORB, have some conditions, but rather than being readmitted under a detention order, you would be arrested under the Mental Health Act if you don't follow the disposition. And an absolute discharge means that there are no longer any conditions under the ORB, but again, our client population, individuals with developmental disabilities, this rarely occurs.
So when someone's under a detention order, that means that if they're in breach of their disposition, we can order them to be readmitted into hospital under a Form 49, which is different than a Form 1. The Form 1 is used under the Mental Health Act. A Form 49 is part of the Canadian Criminal Code. So even if a person's detention order states community living, technically they still live at the hospital with the privilege of living in the community with an approved housing provider. That was good. Sorry. So, restrictions of liberty. So, they take client rights really seriously within the forensic mental health system. So when the level of detention increases, so for example, if a person breaches their disposition, they're readmitted to hospital under a Form 49, and they're in an inpatient unit, they will meet within 7 days for what we call a restriction of liberty hearing. So they want to make sure that the clinical decision that we made to have them back in hospital was actually necessary. And if they determine that we did the wrong thing, they'll bring them back in the community. So they are monitoring, like it really comes from a client-centered and client-right-based approach. There you go.
All right, so clients who are the subject of an ORB disposition are,
Clients who are, that's.
yeah, oh yeah, sorry, that's, yeah. Sorry, I was watching Love is Blind as well last night. There's a continuum of care that includes assessment, treatment, and rehabilitation, and client recovery. There are secure and general secure units, community-based care, and consultation and specialty services. So, for instance, sometimes if we notice that a person's acting out inappropriately sexually, we'll make a referral to the sexual behaviors clinic at CAMH.
So the office of the person in charge is CAMH's liaison to the ORB. So all matters pertaining to admission, assessment, movement, transfer, discharge of ORB patients are coordinated and tracked by OPIC. So even like when we find a DS housing provider, like we have to give so much information to them about what does that look like, what is the location, what's the environment, what is the staffing ratio, like all this sort of stuff, and they determine whether or not that person can live there. And so the staff then become what we call approved persons. So they're approved by the office of the person in charge to be able to have oversight of that person. While our forensic teams are still responsible for risk management. And they're also responsible for scheduling ORB hearings, ensuring that the hospital reports to the ORB are processed in a timely fashion, reviewing privilege requests, and representing CAMH at ORB hearings. Now, any forensic staff members, like on the outpatient team, we're representatives of the office of the person in charge. We are not lay people in this circumstance. There you go.
All right, so risk management in the community. This consists of services provided by the Forensic Outpatient Service, the Extended Forensic Outpatient Service, and us, our case managers, clinicians, and forensic psychiatrists. Individual dispositions determine how often a person must meet with the case management team, and there's a mandate to ensure public safety within the least onerous and least restrictive conditions possible. So again, we're trying to minimize, the amount of restrictions that these individuals have.
So, what needs to be immediately communicated to the case management team? So, any breaches of the disposition, any missed or refused medication, any incident reports completed, instances of aggression, self-injury, environmental destruction, or elopement, any other hospital visits, so for medical reasons, any changes in mental or physical status, and the use of substances. And typically, breaches result in the individual's readmission into hospital under a Form 49, which we had discussed before. There you go, exactly on time. Yeah.